But The Second Blind Son is a medieval Norse setting. And so it has a historical vibe, but it has a whole fantasy world around it, a fictional, mythical world around it. And I drew a lot on Odin and the stories of the Norse god to build the world. And again, it's a companion book to The First Girl Child. And just those two were such pleasures to write, totally self-indulgent, because it was nice to make up most things after writing, some heavy historicals, to just go in and say, I'm going to make up every single thing. It has been that was fun. And that book actually continues to be one of my favorites. And it's kind of a quiet, the sequels are always a little quieter than the first ones, but yeah, it's been a fun one. The Unknown Beloved is a book that I came across after writing the Songbook of Benny Lament. I had done a lot of history on the mob, and I came across a character, a real life person, who his name was Michael Malone, and he was one of the people that helped to bring down Al Capone. He and Elliot Ness knew each other, but he was a treasury agent, and he had worked on all types of. He worked on the Lindbergh baby case. He was this quiet, kind of in the shadows, truly in the shadows guy, but he was embedded with Al Capone's organization for 18 months. And I just think this guy was so tough, but he just fascinated me. And his story was a kind of a sad one. And I as I went into it, he just kind of came to life in my mind. And I did a what if, because Elliot Ness went to Cleveland after his big showy, taking down Al Capone. He went to Cleveland, and he didn't have nearly as good a press in Cleveland as he did, during the Capone years. In fact, it was the first serial murder. He's actually considered the first known serial murder, at least that's what we call him, in the US. And they had to gather a whole group of people together to kind of profile. It was kind of the beginning of all of that stuff, profiling and things. But Elliot Ness had this murderer called at the time they called him the torso murderer in Cleveland. And it still is considered unsolved, although I believe it was solved. And I believe Elliot Ness knows who it is. But this character, Michael Malone, and Elliot Ness, from this murder mystery grew this whole other fictional story. And Michael Malone was my main male character. My main female character was fictional, but that was a lot of fun. Set in the 1930s, pre-World War II. Totally different from what I usually do because it had the murder mystery background. But again, historical, had a little magical realism in it, a lot of magical realism in it. And it was a lot of these things that I love all put together. I've said it before because it's absolutely true for me. The more that I research, the more it feels like channeling, for whatever, for a lack of a better word. And it does, you start to really inhabit these characters. You start to see them in they're in every dimension, in a full dimension. And it's my favorite thing about writing. It's hard because there's a certain obligation you have to real characters and real people. But at the same time, we know so little about, we have a Wikipedia page type entries on many of these people. And like Michael Malone, nothing, he was a shadowy figure in the background and a mob documentary that I'd seen. And then of course I went down the rabbit hole. But there's an obligation that comes with it because you really feel for these people. They were real people with real struggles. But at the same time, it's wonderful to kind of give them life again and give them a story again and make people, take a second look or a first look in many cases at these really interesting people that have already lived. My most recent book, A Girl Called Samson, is the first time I've taken a real woman in history and written from first person and written a story that really did exist, but there was just so little information on. And she's never been fictionalized before. There's books about her, but very little, and not in, not fictionalized the way that I did. Deborah Sampson, it's a book called A Girl Called Sampson. It just came out in April of this year, of 23. And I discovered her, it was of all days, July 4th of 2021, the 4th of July, Independence Day. And she came up in my feed about women of the revolution. And I taught American history. And so for me to not know who Deborah Sampson was kind of like, I felt a little stung by that. And I thought, who is this woman? And I went down a rabbit hole, and by the end of the week had written a proposal from my publisher. I want to write about this woman. I had, things had really stood out to me from the little that was known about her, that I immediately, my wheels started turning, and I could see her and her story. But she dressed up as a soldier during, it was in 1780, so the tail end of the Revolutionary War. But still, it was a slog for about a year and a half after that. She joined up, was light infantry, so wasn't just, kind of a cook or a orderly or, one of the grunts. She was light infantry, and she made it all the way to the end of the war, disguised as a soldier. She was very tall for the times, extremely tall for a woman, lanky. She knew how to shoot. She knew how to, she was extremely capable, extremely smart, and wanted to be part of she wanted to do her part. And she didn't want to do it the way that, was prescribed for the times. And I just absolutely fell in love with her. So yeah, A Girl Called Sampson.
What was your research curve like into that one?
Like I said, there is not a lot written about her. In fact, there's not a lot written about most women that played a big part, and they played as bigger roles as women play now. I'm a firm believer that the roles may be a little different, but they played big roles. I don't know why they were left out of the history. I can't explain that. But she played a big role. And what I started to do was I read everything I could find on her first. And there was a lot of middle grade, little thin books about kind of 10-page, 15-page books that were helpful, imaginings of other authors putting her life together. But then I read a lot of books from the time to get a feel for the setting and the way that people thought. I was lucky enough to, Dr. Thatcher, who is in the book, anybody that's written about the Revolutionary War has read his compendium. It's journal entries from his time attached to several different brigades during the war, during the Revolutionary War. So he has this huge compendium of daily life during the revolution. And it just so happened that he was attached to General Patterson's brigade. General Patterson is the general that Deborah Sampson actually became an aide to this general. And so even though he never mentions Deborah Sampson. And by he added things after the war. So at some point, General Patterson found out about her, actually remained a friend all through the rest of their lives, a very close friend. And I actually think he found out earlier. And I gave them a pretty deep relationship that I don't know that they had, but I sensed it, that there was a very deep friendship in real life. But it was so wild to read Dr. Thatcher's accounts and talk about General Patterson, who also isn't very well known, the youngest general in the war, except for Lafayette. But Lafayette was a Frenchman, so maybe we can count that General Patterson as the youngest American. But it was just wild to see kind of the day by day what life would have looked like for her, where they were stationed, what they did. So I was able to glean a lot from other sources, from other original sources, and then just spend time getting it right, what I felt like was right. And that took a little bit. I had a musical background. I sang with Gladys Knight for 7 years. It's a wild story. I was in her gospel choir, and we probably did, I don't know, 200 different gigs, which is a lot for a choir, for a gospel choir, because she had her own thing going, obviously, all through that time. But I got to know her, and I got to know her story. And Benny Lament isn't it isn't Gladys Knight's story. The Songbook of Benny Lament is not Gladys Knight's story, but what her story did for me, and what knowing her did for me, and singing with her and having that background myself, it first of all, it gave me courage to write it, because I thought I have an insight here that many people don't. And I was inspired by her story, and I held off for a long time till I felt like I had the chops to write a story set in the 60s, which was so fraught. I mean, we think that the times we live in are hard, but it's really comforting to look back over history and to be a historical writer, because you realize that life has always been really, really wild, really hard. And I immersed myself in the music, but I also knew her story, and I was able to kind of draw on that. And I'm a songwriter, so there's music lyrics all through the book. I based the character of Benny Lament, who it's written first person. Benny Lament is the songwriter. He's a piano player. Has mob ties that he's wanted to escape. I gave him the name of my own Uncle Jack. Lamento is his father's name, so the Benny Lament was a shortened stage name from that. My own Sicilian uncle. So it was just, I wrote it from first person, but he was immersed in this turbulent musical scene, and I drew on what I did know, and made sure that I represented in a way that I felt like correctly drew on the times, and just drew on the crazy 60s. There's a beautiful love story in it. There's murder mystery, there's politics, there's the mob undercurrents. It was a fun book to write, but also really intimidating. I am super excited about this next book. And I'm not excited because I think it's going to be received or anything any differently or better or worse than any other book I've written. But I grew up I'm a little small town in the West, and right over the hill from me, Butch Cassidy was born right over the hill from me. And I've always been fascinated by him because I feel like I understood exactly the world he came from, even though we were born 100 years apart. He was born in 1867 and I was born in 1974, 100 years apart. But the world that we inhabited, as far as the landscape and the small town and the religious aspects, all of the stuff that we were born into is the same. And the valley he was born in is one of my favorite. Every time I go through it, I feel something. And, I just thought, I'm going to write this story, and, whatever happens, happens. But I guess I got courage from the fact that I wrote Michael Malone and then Deborah Sampson. And I'm like, well, why not Butch Cassidy? So there is a book coming out in April of 24. It's called The Outlaw Noble Salt. I gave him a moniker, but it is a what if story with Butch Cassidy. What if, when he left the US in 1901, and we all know the story of Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, and the great shootout scene at the end of that great 1969 iconic film. But what about those years in between? And a lot of people don't think Butch Cassidy actually died. His sister, he was the oldest of 13. His sister swears he did not, and she went to her grave with that. So I took this really kind of tragic character of Butch Cassidy, because he was quite the Robin Hood, and created a whole alternate ending to his story. And it was just a lot of fun to write. Actually, the title came to me before. I didn't want to do The Outlaw Butch Cassidy, first of all, because it sounds like nonfiction. and it's not, it's fictionalized. And I like the what it says about, well, first of all, the name Noble Salt has a lot of meaning for the book. And I loved the whole feel of that. It had a feel of the old Western title, but yet still having the outlaw in the title also. You know, it's going to be a fun book. It's going to be totally different. Again, I do totally different every time, but that's what's fun.